You've seen it so many times that it no longer shocks you. A lone man nailed to two wooden beams, his arms stretched, blood on his forehead, a crown of thorns digging into skin. Sometimes the sky is dark, sometimes there's a glow around him. You've seen it in churches, on necklaces, on canvas, and in film, always the same pose, always the same face. We call it the crucifixion as if it only ever happened once, as if that man, Jesus, was the only one who ever hung there, but Jesus was not the first to be crucified, and he certainly wasn't the last. Long before Golgotha, before Pilate, before the crowd shouted, "Crucify him," the Roman Empire had perfected the art of execution by nail and wood. They crucified slaves who dared to run. They crucified rebels who dared to speak. They crucified the conquered to remind the living who ruled, and they did it not in secret but in public, at crossroads, along highways, on city walls. The message was clear. Defy the empire and this is how you end. After the Spartacus rebellion in 71 BC, Rome lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crosses. 6,000 men, mostly slaves, were nailed up in a single gesture of control. Their bodies were left to rot, picked apart by birds, watched by travelers. It wasn't about justice, it was about spectacle. Crucifixion was Rome's way of turning death into a billboard. So when Jesus was sentenced, the soldiers didn't need new tools. They didn't invent a punishment. They followed protocol: strip him, beat him, make him carry the beam until his knees buckle, nail his wrists, hoist the cross, wait, watch. Let him die slowly, not from blood loss, but from exhaustion, suffocation, dehydration. The method wasn't special. The target just happened to be remembered. Most weren't. Their names are lost: the children, the slaves, the poor, the nameless. Their bodies collapsed under the same sun, nailed to the same kind of wood under the same empire. But no one wrote their gospels. No one carved their image into gold. They were just gone. The tragedy of the crucifixion isn't only that it happened to one man, it's that it happened to thousands, and we only chose to remember one. Because it's easier to mythologize a savior than it is to face the system that killed him, and so many others, not for holiness, but for order. Rome didn't crucify Jesus because he was the Son of God. Rome crucified him because it crucified anyone who challenged its authority. The point wasn't to kill him. The point was to make people watch and fear. That's what crucifixion was for, and for most it worked. Crucifixion wasn't rare. It wasn't reserved. It wasn't a last resort. It was routine, a standard tool in the Roman arsenal for public punishment. It was what you did when you didn't just want someone to die, but wanted their death to be remembered by everyone else. In a world where rebellion simmered beneath the surface, in the provinces, in the markets, in the minds of slaves, Rome didn't gamble with subtlety. It ruled with demonstration. It ruled with fear made visible. And nothing made fear more visible than a naked, broken body nailed to a cross in the center of town. You didn't have to be powerful to be crucified. You just had to be inconvenient. Slaves were crucified for stealing scraps of food, foreigners for breaking curfews, soldiers for deserting. In some cases, children were crucified alongside their parents to complete the punishment. Crucifixion was not a sign of guilt proven, it was a sign of status or the lack of it. If you were poor, if you were foreign, if you were at the bottom, your body was eligible. The law didn't need much to justify it. A rumor, a whisper, a missing coin, and the wood was already being raised. It happened everywhere. On hills outside Jerusalem, along the Appian Way in Italy, on the beaches of Carthage, in the alleys of Rome and Gaul. There are recorded cases of mass crucifixions, dozens in a day, hundreds over a rebellion. One Roman governor ordered 2,000 men crucified in a single campaign in Judea, their crosses forming what was described as a forest of the condemned. Another commander in Syria crucified prisoners in front of their own villages, forcing families to watch. The goal wasn't punishment, it was paralysis. It worked because it was slow. Death didn't come quickly, it took hours, sometimes days. The position of the body forced the lungs to collapse, but not all at once. You could push yourself up with your feet to gasp for air, but every time you did, the nails tore further through the bone, and eventually you stopped. Not from bleeding, from exhaustion, from suffocation, from the weight of your own body slowly killing you. Sometimes birds would start eating before you were dead. Sometimes soldiers would break your legs just to finish it faster. But most of the time, Rome let you hang and rot, and it worked because it was seen. That was the point. The cross wasn't hidden behind walls. It wasn't a quiet execution behind stone doors. It was elevated, displayed. Placed where the most people would pass, where children would see it, where merchants would whisper, where other rebels would think twice. The message was never subtle. It didn't have to be. Rome didn't ask for loyalty. It demanded obedience. And crucifixion was its most efficient way of saying, "You belong to us, and if you forget that, this is where you'll end up." By the time Jesus was crucified, the ritual was refined. It had rules, patterns, assigned duties. Rome didn't need permission from religion. It didn't care about moral outrage. It only cared about precedent. And precedent said, nail them up, leave them there, and let everyone else live with the memory. Crucifixion wasn't a spectacle because it was unique. It was a spectacle because it was normal. And the more normal it became, the more terrifying it was. So no, crucifixion wasn't rare. It was bureaucracy sharpened into pain. It was the empire turned inside out. It was what you did when you wanted to kill someone slowly, publicly, and completely. And it was done so often, so efficiently, that most of the victims didn't even make it into the records. They just became bones on the roadside, forgotten, unmarked, unburied, until one of them by accident or destiny it was called the Servile War. Rome called it a rebellion, the slaves called it hope. In 73 BC, a man named Spartacus, a Thracian, a gladiator, a man once trained to die for sport, escaped from a gladiator school in Capua. He wasn't alone, dozens fled with him, then hundreds, then thousands. Within a year, the Roman countryside was on fire, estates were burned, slave chains were broken, senators hid in their villas while field hands picked up swords. Spartacus didn't just want to fight, he wanted to leave. To break the grip of Rome and escape north across the Alps to freedom. But Rome wasn't going to let its slaves walk away. For 2 years they fought. Spartacus defeated Roman legions, humiliated governors, and turned a ragged force of fugitives into an army. At its peak, it's believed he commanded over 70,000 former slaves, men and women who had been branded, beaten, and sold, now marching in formation, armed with stolen blades and raw rage. Rome panicked. The Senate appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, to crush the rebellion once and for all. Crassus brought discipline, brutality. He reinstated decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a fleeing Roman unit, just to make his own troops fear him more than they feared Spartacus. The final battle came in 71 BC. Spartacus died on the field, his body was never found, his army collapsed. Those who weren't killed in the fighting, about 6,000 men, were captured alive. And that's when Rome delivered its message. They didn't just execute them. They crucified all 6,000 along the Appian Way, the most famous road in Italy, stretching from Capua to Rome. It took days, maybe weeks. The crosses were spaced out carefully, deliberately, one after another, mile after mile. From the site of the rebellion to the heart of the Republic, travelers passed between corpses. Families visited relatives in Rome by walking beneath rotting, sun-scorched, bleeding bodies. Merchants hauled grain past men still gasping. Soldiers marched between poles of broken arms and swollen feet. The wind carried the smell for miles, the birds feasted for months. This wasn't justice, it wasn't punishment, it was a performance. A lesson carved into flesh and nailed to cedar. Rome didn't care if these men had surrendered. Rome cared that they had dared to dream of freedom. Crucifixion was the answer, not just to rebellion, but to memory. They wanted the people to remember what happens when the lower classes believe they deserve more than chains. They wanted no songs, no statues, no graves, only silence, only fear, only bones on the roadside and the creak of ropes swinging in the wind, and it worked. The slave rebellion stopped, the countryside quieted. The name Spartacus vanished from the mouths of citizens for a generation. Only later, much later, did the myth return stripped of blood, polished by time, recast in marble and cinema. But the reality was this. Rome hung 6,000 men for wanting to be free, and it made everyone walk through their corpses to get to the capital. No empire forgets how to make an example. Rome just perfected it. Crucifixion wasn't just about dying. It was about how you died. It started with stripping. Always, you were reduced to bare skin, not just for humiliation, but to expose every inch of your body to the sun, the wind, the eyes of the crowd. There was no dignity allowed. You were no longer a person, you were a message. Then came the beating. Often with a flagrum, a Roman whip laced with bone, metal, or hooks. It tore the skin, exposed the muscle. Not always fatally, that wasn't the goal. The goal was to weaken you, break you down, make you bleed, but keep you alive, because the real punishment hadn't even started. Next came the beam. You were forced to carry it, the patibulum, across your shoulders. It weighed anywhere from 70 to 120 pounds. Your back already shredded, your arms burning, you stumbled through jeering streets. People threw things, spit, laughed. You collapsed. They whipped you back up. You collapsed again. Eventually, someone else might be forced to carry it for you, not out of mercy, but out of Roman efficiency. They needed you on that cross, not dead in the dirt. At the execution site, the upright pole was already there, the stipes, planted in the ground, reused for dozens of victims. Your beam would be attached to it. First, they nailed your wrists, not through the palms like in paintings, but through the base of the hand where the bones could hold the weight. Nails were thick, crude iron. They shattered nerves. sent shocks of fire through the arms, then your feet, often one over the other, through the arch or separately, twisted sideways. Once the nailing was done, the cross was raised. That was when the real death began. You didn't bleed out quickly. Crucifixion wasn't about bleeding, it was about suffocating. When your body hung in that position, arms stretched, chest open, knees bent, it became harder and harder to breathe. The muscles around your diaphragm froze. You could only inhale if you pushed up with your legs, and every push drove the nails deeper. Every breath was agony, and you had to keep doing it, over and over, just to stay alive. Eventually, you couldn't, your lungs filled with fluid. Your heartbeat slowed, your organs began to fail. You trembled, you hallucinated, you urinated on yourself, you defecated. Your body turned cold, even in the heat. Your vision narrowed. And still, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, you stayed alive. Barely. If the soldiers grew impatient, they would break your legs with an iron mallet. One swing, two. That made it impossible to push up for air. You suffocated faster. If the crowd wanted spectacle, they might stab you in the side, in the stomach, to see what poured out. Blood, bile, froth from the lungs, but often they just waited. The Romans were experts in death. They knew how long it took. They had done this 1,000 times, and after you died, you were left up there to rot, to bloat, to feed the birds, to blacken in the sun until no one could recognize you. Your body became a warning long after your breath was gone. That was the true power of crucifixion. It wasn't just about killing, it was about what killing could teach others. That pain has no limit. That death could be public, slow, and devoid of honor. That the state could take everything from you, even your last breath, and use it for propaganda. Crucifixion worked because it didn't end when you died. It ended when people walked past your body and whispered, "I will never do what he did." What? You've seen it so many times that it no longer shocks you. A lone man nailed to 2 wooden beams, his arms stretched, blood on his forehead, a crown of thorns digging into skin. Sometimes the sky is dark, sometimes there's a glow around him. You've seen it in churches, on necklaces, on canvas, and in film. Always the same pose, always the same face. We call it the crucifixion as if it only ever happened once. As if that man, Jesus, was the only one who ever hung there, but he was. Jesus was not the first to be crucified, and he certainly wasn't the last. Long before Golgotha, before Pilate, before the crowd shouted, "Crucify him," the Roman Empire had perfected the art of execution by nail and wood. They crucified slaves who dared to run. They crucified rebels who dared to speak. They crucified the conquered to remind the living who ruled. And they did it not in secret, but in public, at crossroads, along highways, on city walls. The message was clear. Defy the empire, and this is how you end. After the Spartacus rebellion in 71 BC, Rome lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crosses. 6,000 men, mostly slaves, were nailed up in a single gesture of control. Their bodies were left to rot, picked apart by birds, watched by travelers. It wasn't about justice, it was about spectacle. Crucifixion was Rome's way of turning death into a billboard. So when Jesus was sentenced, the soldiers didn't need new tools. They didn't invent a punishment. They followed protocol: strip him, beat him, make him carry the beam until his knees buckle, nail his wrists, hoist the cross, wait, watch. Let him die slowly, not from blood loss, but from exhaustion, suffocation, dehydration. The method wasn't special. The target just happened to be remembered. Most weren't. Their names are lost: the children, the slaves, the poor, the nameless. Their bodies collapsed under the same sun, nailed to the same kind of wood under the same empire. But no one wrote their gospels. No one carved their image into gold. They were just gone. The tragedy of the crucifixion isn't only that it happened to one man. It's that it happened to thousands, and we only chose to remember one. Because it's easier to mythologize a savior than it is to face the system that killed him, and so many others, not for holiness, but for order. Rome didn't crucify Jesus because he was the Son of God. Rome crucified him because it crucified anyone who challenged its authority. The point wasn't to kill him. The point was to make people watch and fear. That's what crucifixion was for, and for most it worked. Crucifixion wasn't rare. It wasn't reserved. It wasn't a last resort. It was routine, a standard tool in the Roman arsenal for public punishment. It was what you did when you didn't just want someone to die, but wanted their death to be remembered by everyone else. In a world where rebellion simmered beneath the surface, in the provinces, in the markets, in the minds of slaves, Rome didn't gamble with subtlety. It ruled with demonstration. It ruled with fear made visible. And nothing made fear more visible than a naked, broken body nailed to a cross in the center of town. You didn't have to be powerful to be crucified. You just had to be inconvenient. Slaves were crucified for stealing scraps of food, foreigners for breaking curfews, soldiers for deserting. In some cases, children were crucified alongside their parents to complete the punishment. Crucifixion was not a sign of guilt proven, it was a sign of status or the lack of it. If you were poor, if you were foreign, if you were at the bottom, your body was eligible. The law didn't need much to justify it. A rumor, a whisper, a missing coin, and the wood was already being raised. It happened everywhere. On hills outside Jerusalem, along the Appian Way in Italy, on the beaches of Carthage, in the alleys of Rome and Gaul. There are recorded cases of mass crucifixions, dozens in a day, hundreds over a rebellion. One Roman governor ordered 2,000 men crucified in a single campaign in Judea, their crosses forming what was described as a forest of the condemned. Another commander in Syria crucified prisoners in front of their own villages, forcing families to watch. The goal wasn't punishment, it was paralysis. Rome didn't just want you dead, it wanted you erased. That's why crucifixion wasn't carried out in secret. It wasn't hidden behind walls or curtains. There was no hood, no blindfold, no last meal. You didn't get silence, you didn't get closure. What you got was humiliation, methodical, intentional, and visible from a distance. You were stripped naked, no exceptions. Every crucified body, regardless of gender or age, hung exposed. Rome didn't care about dignity. It cared about domination. If people flinched at the sight, good. If families wept, better. This was psychological warfare, not just against the condemned, but against anyone watching who might be thinking dangerous thoughts. Your body was used, that's all it was, a display, a prop, a message carved in flesh. They crucified you in marketplaces, in front of temples, outside city gates. They waited for festivals, for harvest days, for high traffic. They wanted crowds, they wanted children to ask questions. They wanted neighbors to whisper, that's what happens when you disobey. And the worst part, the shame didn't end with you. It infected your family, your name, your bloodline. If you were crucified, your children might never marry, your relatives might be shunned. People avoided your home, afraid the stain of your death might cling to their feet. Even burying a crucified body could bring suspicion, which is why most victims were left to rot. No grave, no prayer, no marker. That's what crucifixion did. It deleted you, not just from life, but from memory. If you were a rebel, your cause died with you. If you were a slave, your resistance was rewritten as deviance. If you were innocent, it didn't matter. You were naked, nailed, and nameless. That's all anyone remembered, and Rome counted on that. Shame was part of the sentence. The pain broke your body, but the shame broke the idea of you so thoroughly that even those who loved you would hesitate to say your name aloud. Crucifixion wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a punishment gone too far, it was a science. A system of emotional and spiritual destruction perfected over centuries. It ensured that not only did you die, but that your death taught everyone else to stay quiet. Jesus wasn't crucified alone that day. According to the Gospels, there were two others beside him, two criminals, two nobodies, two bodies meant to blur together into the background, because that's what Rome wanted, not martyrs. Not movements, just meat on wood and silence in the streets, and for most people it worked. Rome did not spare the weak, it didn't make exceptions for the poor, and it certainly didn't stop at children. If you were born at the bottom, born to a slave, born in a province, born in a hut instead of a villa, your life had no guarantee, your death even less. Crucifixion was never about guilt, it was about position. If you had none, then you had no shield. Historical records don't always say child. They say boy, minor, son of a rebel. They use terms like too young to carry arms or underweight, but the implication is clear. Some of those nailed to crosses were children. Not all were 10 years old, not all were toddlers, but some were. After the Jewish revolts in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome crucified en masse. Whole families were targeted. Men were hung first, women later, and the children, if not sold into slavery, were executed alongside their parents. Not because of what they did, but because of what they represented: continuity, future defiance. A bloodline that had to be severed. And then there were the poorest of Rome's own people, the beggars, the thieves, the desperate. If a slave stole a piece of bread, crucifixion was one possible punishment. If a homeless man was accused of touching the wrong property, his body could be hanging by sundown. The law was flexible, yes, but only in one direction. Down. There are Roman legal codes that make it explicit. Crucifixion is for the lowest, those who don't have property or patronage or protection, which meant it became a punishment by design for those already broken. The elite didn't get crucified, they got exiled, they got poison. They got privacy, but if you were a nobody, if your name didn't mean anything, if your death wouldn't inconvenience a senator, then the cross was waiting. The process didn't change. They didn't use smaller nails for smaller bodies. They didn't offer quicker deaths for quieter crimes. Whether you were 30 or 13, the method was the same: humiliation, exposure, suffocation. The poor weren't just victims, they were tools. Rome used their broken bodies to send a message to the rest of the poor: This is what happens when you forget your place. Every crucifixion was a broadcast, a grotesque, open-air lesson in hierarchy. The children weren't special, they weren't spared. They were just quieter when they screamed, and after they died, like the others, they were left to decay in the open. The birds didn't care how old the flesh was, neither did Rome. Crucifixion was not about proportion, it was about power. It didn't scale to crime, it scaled to status, and if you had none, then you were never truly safe. Jesus wasn't crucified because Rome saw him as unique. He was crucified because Rome saw him as typical. To the empire, he was just another problem from the provinces, a man stirring up unrest, challenging order, gathering followers, questioning authority. There were many like him, prophets, rebels, self-proclaimed messiahs. Some talked of heaven, some talked of justice, some talked of revolution. Rome didn't bother sorting out which was which. If you gathered a crowd, you were a threat, and Rome didn't tolerate threats. By the time Jesus carried his cross through Jerusalem, hundreds, maybe thousands, had done the same. Pilate had signed more than one execution order. The soldiers who nailed Jesus to the wood had done it before. The crowd had likely seen crucifixions before, walked past them, learned to look away. There was no ceremony, no hesitation, just another day in a system designed to erase. Strip, beat, nail, hoist, wait, that was the rhythm. The routine, Jesus didn't escape it. He passed through it like all the others, blood on his skin, splinters in his back, breath shrinking in his lungs. We remember his last words. But what about the thousands who had no final statement? No gospel writer nearby, no one recording their agony. They died just as slowly, just as publicly, but their pain became anonymous. What makes Jesus' crucifixion powerful isn't the method, it's the memory. He is one of very, very few crucifixion victims whose name survived, whose story was preserved, whose suffering was turned into symbol. The rest, they were bodies, they were examples, they were erased. Jesus became a savior. But for Rome, he was a statistic, one more cross, one more warning, that's the point. His death wasn't exceptional, it was ordinary. And in that ordinariness, in that routine brutality, lies the true horror of crucifixion. It wasn't that Jesus was singled out, it's that he was. Rome crucified thousands and meant for none of them to be remembered. Jesus defied that, not just by what he taught, not just by how he died, but because somehow his voice echoed, while the others vanished. The cross we know so well was meant to silence him, but it didn't, and maybe that's why we remember, because his survival in memory is the only thing that broke the pattern. Rome didn't invent crucifixion, but Rome turned it into an institution. Other cultures had used similar methods. The Persians hung bodies. The Carthaginians nailed people to walls, but no one standardized it the way Rome did. No one built it into the logic of empire as visibly, as efficiently, as shamelessly. Why? Because crucifixion worked, it was cheap, wood was plentiful, nails were reusable, soldiers needed no special training. There was no need for judges or executioners in robes, just a few strong backs, a hammer, and a hill. It was public. You didn't need to print pamphlets or give speeches. One crucifixion could silence an entire village. The body did the talking, the flies carried the message. It was slow. Fast deaths don't linger in the mind, but a man who hangs for days, who screams, who gasps, who soils himself in front of his children, that sticks. That memory teaches obedience better than any edict, and above all, it was predictable. Rome knew exactly how long it took to kill someone, how many nails were needed, how much pain the body could absorb. Crucifixion was not chaos. It was administration. The empire didn't just rule with armies, it ruled with symbols. The eagle, the forum, the aqueduct, the road. And among those symbols stood the cross, not yet sacred, not yet golden, but raw, wooden, stained with the rot of last week's rebel. It was placed where it could be seen, at the city gates, on high hills, outside theaters, where crowds gathered, where travelers passed, where the smell couldn't be ignored, and it was strategic. Rome used crucifixion not just on the guilty, but on the inconvenient, on the loud, on the hopeful, on the ones who might inspire others. The empire didn't wait for rebellion to become war. It strangled rebellion in infancy with a cross, a nail, and a crowd. This wasn't about justice, it was about performance. A rebel leader is captured, crucify him where his people can see. A village resists taxation. Crucify a dozen men at the well. A slave tries to escape, crucify him at the market square. Let the punishment become a backdrop to daily life, so ordinary that people learn to keep their heads down without being told. And it worked. Rebellions didn't stop, but they slowed. Fear became habitual. People policed themselves. Citizens reported each other. Mothers told their sons, "Don't speak out, you know what happens." And that was the brilliance of Rome's cruelty. It didn't just destroy the body, it infected the mind. It turned crucifixion into a social vaccine against dissent, not by silencing one person, but by showing 10,000 what silence looks like. The genius wasn't in how they killed, it was in how they made everyone watch. The cross was never meant to be holy. To the Romans, it was a tool, a message written in blood, a billboard nailed together by soldiers, built not to inspire but to terrify. The cross was filth, it was fear. It was a place where skin tore, bones cracked, and names were forgotten. There was nothing sacred about it, and yet 2,000 years later it stands on altars. It hangs around necks in gold and silver. It glows in stained glass windows. It is traced in the air when people pray. It has become the most recognized symbol of faith in the world. How? How does something so brutal, so dehumanizing, so soaked in humiliation become a symbol of hope? It didn't happen overnight, it didn't happen by design. It happened slowly, as memory blurred and meaning shifted. In the years after Jesus' crucifixion, his followers didn't wear crosses, they didn't sculpt them. The cross was too raw, too fresh, too horrifying. It was a reminder of how their teacher died like a criminal, naked, mocked, abandoned. In those early days, the cross was shameful. It was whispered about, avoided. But as time passed, something changed. The cross didn't disappear, it refused to fade. It haunted the stories, the letters, the testimonies, and eventually it transformed, not because people forgot what it was, but because they began to see something beneath it. Not just wood, not just nails, but sacrifice, endurance, victory through surrender. What was once a Roman death sentence became, somehow, a Christian proclamation. That love is stronger than empire, that suffering is not the end, that what was meant to break a man became the very thing that made him unforgettable. And as Christianity spread, so did the cross, not as an execution device, but as a reversal of power. In the hands of believers, the cross was reclaimed, turned inside out. What Rome used to erase became a way to remember. What Rome used to silence became a voice, but that transformation came with tension. Because as the cross became sacred, its origin, its filth, its horror, its history was softened, sanitized, polished. The nails became symbols. The wounds became metaphors, the agony became art. People forgot that the cross was never meant to be looked at with comfort. It was not clean, it was not quiet, it was not beautiful. It was a place where the state killed people slowly. Where the weak were made examples, where birds picked out eyes and crowds turned away. But perhaps that's the very reason it endured, because in a world ruled by violence, the cross tells a different story, that even in the worst of humanity, there can be something worth remembering, something worth redeeming. And so the cross survived, not because it was sacred, but because people needed it to be. Because if even that can become holy, then maybe anything can. We remember the one. His name is carved into churches, whispered in prayers, printed in every language on earth. We know how he died. We know who condemned him, what he said, where he was buried, and what came after. But the others, they didn't get last words, they didn't get mourners, they didn't get names. They were nailed up just the same. They bled just the same. They choked, screamed, went silent just the same. We forget them not because they mattered less, but because the world chose to remember only one. And maybe that's the true power of empire, not just in how it punishes, but in how it decides who is worth mourning. Rome didn't just kill bodies, it killed memory. It turned the cross into a device of erasure. It wanted you to forget the 6,000 slaves crucified along the Appian Way, the rebels outside Jerusalem, the women, the poor, the children. The ones who died gasping, nameless, while passersby walked a little faster. And we obliged, we looked away. We sanctified the wood, but not the flesh. We gold-plated the nails, but never asked who else they pierced. The irony is sharp. The very symbol meant to make people disappear is now impossible to ignore. The cross stands everywhere, but it rarely makes us uncomfortable, because we've polished it, because we've stripped it of the screams. Because we remember one death so completely that we've erased the rest, but the truth is still buried in Roman soil, in bones not blessed, in names not recorded, in stories never told. And maybe that's why this history matters, not to diminish the one we remember, but to honor the thousands we don't, because if the cross taught us anything, it's that memory is power, and silence too is a sentence. They didn't ask to be remembered, they just didn't deserve to be forgotten. And now, neither do you.